In previous years, the wives would sunbathe topless. But this time, Barbara felt uncomfortable being the only woman and decided to leave her swimsuit top on. Michael and John were chatting and drinking beer in the boat's cockpit. They had been friends for over 15 years. Starting out as roommates in college, their friendship deepened when they married girls who were also close friends. John tried not to show his interest as his friend's wife unbuttoned her top to avoid sunburn from the straps on her back. Barbara lay with her head towards the booth, and John enjoyed talking to her as she had to lift her head slightly to answer, showing a little cleavage. One day she lifted up a little more, and he thought he saw a nipple. John was already enjoying the trip. It was early September, and they set out on their annual voyage from North Carolina to the Bahamas, where they left the boat for the winter. Usually there were 4 of them, but this year John's wife, Marge, was unable to go due to work. The others thought about postponing the trip, but Marge insisted they go. She playfully asked Barbara to keep an eye on John. "Don't worry, I'll make sure he behaves," Barbara said. The first day passed calmly. In the morning, they purchased provisions and made final preparations for the voyage. They set sail from Beaufort about noon. The day was beautiful and warm, and Barbara put on a bikini, lay down on the deck, and basked in the sun. By 4 o'clock, when the sun became less hot, Barbara tied the top of her swimsuit and announced that she would start preparing dinner. Michael teased her that since she was the only woman on board, she would have to do all the women's work. She replied, hugging John, "Sounds good. I might even enjoy some of my responsibilities." Michael laughed and replied, "That's not what I meant." Barbara and John shouted in unison, "Too bad." Everyone was laughing and in a good mood. Although each of the women had many suitors before meeting their husbands, they became good and faithful wives. However, marriage did not stop them from flirting. These couples were so flirtatious with each other that it would be difficult for an outsider to determine who was married to whom. The flirting and banter were fun, but despite the verbal games, neither of them ever allowed themselves to physically touch each other's partner, not even a pat on the butt. Well, except for that stupid night when they switched bed partners for 60 seconds. But that was pretty innocent. The first evening on the boat was quite calm. They had dinner, drank wine, and talked a lot. They allocated watch times, and John offered to give them the bedroom, since he was alone. Around 10, Barbara and Michael went to bed. It was a long day, and Barbara had to be on duty at 2 in the morning. She put on her usual night clothes, panties and a blouse, and Michael put on his boxers. They hugged for a while, but fatigue from the previous days took its toll, and they fell asleep. Barbara woke up around 2 in the morning and went up to the deck. The ocean breeze was cool, so she put on pajama pants and a sweatshirt. John thought, no matter what she wears, she still looks sexy. Barbara and John chatted for a while drinking the coffee she made. The conversation was mainly about what to do while on duty, but Barbara remembered the previous years well and knew her responsibilities. They had already crossed the Gulf Stream and turned south, so everything was relatively calm. John said she just needed to keep an eye on the other boats and stay on course. He went downstairs to get some sleep. 4 hours later, around 6 in the morning, as the sun rose, Michael relieved Barbara, who had gone downstairs to get some rest. There was no room to change clothes on the V berth, so Barbara stood in the main cabin where John was sleeping and took off her pajama pants and sweatshirt. She only had panties underneath and nothing under her sweatshirt. John lay with his back to her and did not move. She put on her doublet and climbed onto the V-shaped bunk. John heard her. He could guess that she was changing clothes. He wanted to turn and look, but even in the dim morning light, it would have been too obvious. He could only imagine. The heat of the day was increasing, and Barbara and John woke up at about the same time, around 10 in the morning. They chatted in the galley while Barbara prepared coffee and breakfast. Over her blouse and panties, she threw on a light robe, which was short and exposed her legs, especially when she was sitting. They joined Michael on deck for coffee and breakfast. They talked, but John had a hard time concentrating on anything other than Barbara's feet. However, he complained that he did not sleep well on the hard bed. Barbara suggested he take a nap on the V bunk later that day. John took the helm while Michael and Barbara sunbathed on deck. John watched Barbara in her bikini with her top untied and remembered the second day of last year's trip. Then the women sunbathed topless on the deck of the boat. It was difficult for him then, and thinking about it now was also difficult. There was a lot of whispering between the two women back then. They both lay face down with their belts unbuckled. But then they rolled over without bothering to tie their straps. John was at the helm. None of them looked in his direction, but they knew he was there. Michael was downstairs, but climbed up into the cabin shortly after it all happened. He and John talked for a long time about how good their wives looked. Michael talked about how good Marge looked, and John hinted that Barbara looked like she could be eaten. This year, at sunset, Barbara played the role of hostess, cooking and cleaning. After a short shower, they ate dinner together in the cabin. The cool ocean breeze made it a little tight, and Barbara was wearing pajama shorts and a braless top. The cold made her nipples hard, which the men noticed. Barbara blushed at their attention, called them perverts, and changed the subject. Around 10, Michael and Barbara went downstairs, leaving John on watch. Michael and Barbara climbed into bed and closed the door. They both had the same idea, to make love quickly. It was a little sad, but after 10 years of marriage and 2 children, their sex life became more about quickies than long-term lovemaking. Of course they made love, but mostly on weekends. The rest of the time it was evening or daytime sessions when the children were already asleep. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the alarm went off. Michael was half asleep. He set the alarm to wake Barbara up for her watch, but she was still asleep. He decided to take her place at the helm and let her sleep until 6 in the morning. Having made coffee, Michael went up to the deck. Michael and John chatted until John wanted to get some sleep. Michael suggested that John sleep on a V-berth rather than a bunk. John knew it wouldn't be hard to end up in bed with Barbara, at least when they were both dressed, but he was surprised by Michael's proposal. John politely replied, "No, it's okay. The bunk isn't that bad." But Michael insisted, "It's not right that you have to sleep on a bunk. Besides, she was cold. You couldn't wake her up even if you tried." John shrugged and went downstairs. He stood in the cabin and wondered what to do. He felt awkward. Michael was just being polite. Michael didn't realize that he shouldn't be so trusting. John wanted to be a good friend, but the thought of Barbara rolling over and hugging him lightly in her sleep was more lustful than friendly. He remembered the short time he spent in bed with her last year. Nothing special, just drunken tomfoolery. The wives had gone to bed a few minutes earlier while she and Michael finished their beers. Men seemed to be accidentally, but in fact deliberately, confused about which beds they should sleep on. The wives giggled and played along, knowing their husbands were just fooling around. Michael slid into Marge's bed, his back turned, and shouted to John, "We must have the wrong beds. This woman is not like Barbara." Marge pressed her back against Michael and laughed. John escalated the situation slightly. Barbara turned her back to him, but John put his arm around her and cupped her chest. Before Barbara could react, he said, "I agree. These breasts look nothing like Marge's." Barbara was a little surprised, because John had never touched her before, but at that moment it seemed pleasant to her. She laughed, turned slightly, and whispered, "You better watch this, or you'll get more than you can handle." Michael, not wanting to be outdone, jokingly shouted, "I'm going to put my hand in her panties and see if she's shaved." Even though he didn't do it, Marge sat down and said, "Okay, the fun's over. It's time for little boys to sleep in their cribs." The men stood up laughing, and the fun ended. It didn't last long, but John still felt aroused, remembering how nice Barbara's breasts felt. It was a joke, but he still had mixed feelings. He took off everything except his boxers and climbed into bed. That night, Barbara woke up and realized that John was lying next to her, not Michael. She wondered how and why John ended up in her bed. Surely Michael knew that they were sleeping together. It was quite erotic for her to be naked in bed with John, and she decided not to wake him, enjoying the sensation, especially if her husband was okay with it. She fell asleep again without moving. Sometime later, John woke up to find Barbara clinging to him. He tried to move away from her, but he had already rested against the hull of the boat and had nowhere to go. He didn't want her to wake up and find them in this position. When the sun came into the cabin around 6 in the morning, they both woke up. They looked at each other and laughed nervously without moving. Barbara didn't seem upset, but demanded to know how John ended up in her bed. He told her about Michael's proposal and said that he was pleasantly surprised to find her naked. She explained how it happened. John reminded her of that brief moment last year when they spent a few minutes together in bed. Barbara smiled at the memory. Barbara was probably talking to Michael about it now, but what did she tell him? What was Michael really thinking when he asked John to sleep with Barbara? Of course he knew she was naked. Did he check them? Was a friendship just ruined? How was he even going to meet Michael after that? John dozed off, his head full of unanswered questions. Michael spent most of the watch thinking about John and Barbara lying in bed together. He suggested it innocently, but after he proposed, he began to have doubts. He couldn't help but think about how Barbara loved to cuddle and did it in her sleep. He started imagining her in panties and a little top, cuddling up to John. Then it dawned on Michael that he had left his wife naked. Oh my God, he thought. She falls asleep after sex and never puts on her clothes again. He hoped that this time she did get dressed. He quickly descended, leaving the boat on autopilot. Approaching the door, he saw the body of his wife, almost covered with a sheet, but pressed against John. The sheet was low enough to see part of her chest. She really was naked. Michael returned to the cabin with several strange thoughts. Firstly, he was afraid that Barbara would wake up and be very angry with him, and this would ruin their trip. He was also a little jealous because John, although asleep, was enjoying his wife's body. What if they wake up? Could something happen? Michael calmed down a little, realizing that they were friends and nothing would happen. He also thought how sexy it would be if he ended up in bed with a sleeping naked Marge. Michael tried to think of something else to pass the time, but it was difficult. Barbara came into the cabin visibly agitated. She asked Michael questions and demanded an explanation as to why she was naked in bed with John. Michael explained the circumstances and swore he didn't know she was naked. He said that he was sorry that John slept on the bunk, and decided that since Barbara was already asleep, nothing bad would happen if John lay down on the V-shaped bunk. Barbara doubted whether he was telling the truth. She knew that Michael could be a little strange, and although he had never expressed any desire to open up their marriage, he enjoyed her teasing and occasional outbursts of jealousy. She wondered if Michael was hoping something would happen. She also thought it might be a test. Michael knew that she was always flirting with John, just like Marge was with him. Perhaps Michael was a little jealous of her and John, and decided to test her to see if anything would happen. He may have spent the night trying to catch them. Most likely, he was telling the truth, but this did not save him from her irritation. Barbara didn't like that he thought she could share a bed with another man as if she belonged to him. He should never have made such a decision. If she had been consulted, she might have agreed, but she would have put on her pajamas and tried not to cuddle with John in her sleep. Barbara was not going to let her husband go so easily. She wasn't angry to the point of throwing dishes, but she was going to make him pay. She decided that today she would be somewhat cold towards him. To make him think about his mistake all day, she decided to make him a little jealous. Her actions that day must have given the impression that there was some kind of moment between her and John. Michael had to go through this test, and this will be the last time he makes such a mistake. John wasn't sure what he'd gotten himself into when he climbed into the cabin after his nap. The thoughts in his head were confused, especially since Barbara left him about 4 hours ago. But he tried to look cheerful and greeted them both as he left the hut. Everything seemed to be fine. Michael handed him a cup of freshly brewed coffee. John felt a little tension between Barbara and Michael and wanted to avoid talking about the previous night. However, Barbara was not going to make it easy for him. As she passed him in the booth, she gently patted his chest with an open palm and playfully asked, "Are you finally getting some rest, sweetie?" This phrase did not escape Michael's attention and would be the first of many. Barbara went down to the cabin to change into her swimsuit. It was their third day in the ocean. On average, they walked over 150 miles a day. Tomorrow, if the weather cooperates and they are lucky, they will arrive at Marsh Harbor in the Bahamas, where the boat will remain for the winter. Barbara returned to the deck in another of her many bikinis. The lunch she brought with her was much more filling than her swimsuit. She brought out a tray of toasted English muffins, topped with slices of ham and poached eggs. There probably should have been hollandaise sauce on top of the eggs, but apparently the boat's provisions didn't have provisions for that. The coffee was served with a can of V8 juice, almost a gourmet dish, not bad for a sailboat. After lunch, Barbara stretched out on the deck. After applying light sunscreen, she slowly removed her top. Michael and John watched, but pretended not to notice. She slowly applied more lotion and lay down on her back. She began a general conversation with John, continuing to treat her husband coldly. After about 45 minutes, Barbara rolled over onto her stomach and called out to John. John felt like he was on pins and needles. He was aware of the tension between Barbara and Michael. Barbara asked him to put some lotion on her back, even though she had always asked Michael to do this in the previous days. Barbara, lying face down in only her bikini bottoms, was a very attractive sight. However, while Michael watched, John had to be very careful in how he touched her. He applied the lotion clinically, but was still slightly aroused by the sight and feel of her nearly naked body. Michael watched John's hands slide over Barbara's bare shoulders and back. He tried not to show any jealousy or anger, knowing that if he did, Barbara might explode. He wondered if she was faking it, or really trying to get revenge, or if the night in bed had somehow changed their relationship. About an hour later, Barbara sat down and said she wanted to go swimming. She was still topless. John couldn't take his eyes off her and suggested that they could follow the boat on a tow rope. It would still be fun and much better than stopping. Barbara said she wanted to try swimming and, while remaining cold to Michael, asked John if he would go with her. John felt awkward and asked Michael to come with her while he steered the boat. But Michael insisted that John go while he steered the boat. John agreed and threw away the stern rope. She and Michael eased the sails a little and slowed the boat to 2 or 3 knots while Barbara lowered the stern ladder. She didn't bother putting her top back on. As Barbara prepared to enter the water, she thought about Michael. All this playing with water would drive him crazy. She started to feel bad for tormenting him and decided that her topless swim with John would be enough to make them even. Barbara and John stepped off the stern of the boat into the water. They reached the end of the line, about 20 feet behind the boat. At first, they stayed apart, but soon got used to each other. Barbara said it was like water skiing without skis. The boat was going fast enough that it was fun and a little hard to hold on to. After a few minutes, they started playing a little. One was holding on to the tow rope, and the other was holding on to it. The one holding the line pretended to be trying to elude the other, leaving him without a line. At first, Barbara held on to John. She was aggressive and had no intention of slipping away. She wrapped her legs around John and placed her hands on his chest. Her wet breasts pressed against his back. John playfully tried to throw her off, but she held on tightly. Then they switched positions. Michael looked at this in amazement. Their wet bodies were so close to each other. He could only see the top of their bodies as the water obscured everything else. Michael began to feel something different. He started to get excited. He wasn't sure if it was because he was watching his wife with John or thinking about how much fun he would have if Marge was here. Barbara held the line and John hugged her. His bathing suit fit snugly around his waist, but was otherwise a little baggy. Remembering their brief moment in bed, John decided that the door was open for some playful contact. He joked that he had water in his eyes and couldn't see. Michael, as before, watched. He could see John's body next to his wife's, and although they were mostly underwater, it seemed to him that John's hands were sometimes near Barbara's bare breasts and sometimes near her bikini bottoms. Michael wasn't angry. He became more and more excited. He enjoyed watching his wife and kept thinking about how much fun he would have here with Marge. They walked back up the tow line, where Michael helped them onto the boat, noticing that Barbara's nipples were hard and John had a significant bulge. He was sure they had been a little naughty. He had a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach, but he also felt a stirring in his own shorts. He couldn't help but wonder what happened in bed. When they were all back on the boat, Barbara declared, "I need to get out of this wetsuit." She was only wearing bikini pants, so there wasn't much to take off. Michael threw her a towel and said, "Go for it." While John and Michael were working on the sails, Barbara wrapped herself in a towel and began taking off her bikini. It was a neat trick to remove the bikini under the towel without exposing too much of yourself. However, the guys caught a few fleeting glances that kept John tense and Michael's arousal visible through his shorts. The men watched her every move. Barbara loved being the center of their attention. After the suit was removed, she sat in the booth, wrapped in only a towel. During the day, they talked about everything, avoiding only the topic of sleep at night. Barbara continued to tease them with the towel. It was already short, and when she sat down, she was almost naked. Moving along the bench, she taunted the guys, glancing between her legs from time to time. As she gestured, the top of the towel loosened and slid down her chest. She ignored it until her nipples were barely showing, and then pulled the towel back up. Several times she stood up and turned her back to the booth to wrap and tighten the towel again. Barbara felt very excited. Ever since she woke up naked next to John and teased him for days, her arousal had only grown. After the bath, she stopped being cold towards Michael. She talked to him more, although she still showed no affection. She noticed bulges appearing in their shorts as her audience became noticeably more appreciative. Finally, she announced that she was going downstairs to change clothes and prepare dinner. After dinner, the three of them sat in the cabin again and talked. Michael still wanted to know what happened when John and Barbara were in bed together, but he didn't know how to ask. Eventually, the conversation turned to John's birthday, which was almost a year ago, right after their last cruise. John and Marge, who lived about 50 miles away, were visiting Barbara and Michael for the weekend. It was John's birthday, and they went to a restaurant for dinner. Everyone ordered the evening's signature dish, pasta with baby shrimp and spicy brown sauce. There was something sensual about the food, or maybe it was the way they ate it. They took turns feeding each other. They made a mess while sucking on the pasta and shrimp, sauce dripping off their chins. When they finished, they weren't ready to go home. Michael suggested going to an exotic dance club where performers performed lap dances. Michael and John thought it was a great idea. The women didn't like it very much, but since it was John's birthday, they agreed. On the way to the club, they talked about how they were going to celebrate John's birthday by giving him a couple of sexy lap dances. They joked with John, saying that he needed iron underwear to avoid tearing his pants. It's not too late, and they got one of the best tables. It was actually a semicircular sofa with a small cocktail table in the center. They had a good view of the stage and the rest of the club. They were surprised to find that there were several couples in the club. They expected it to be only men. It turns out that lap dancing isn't just for men. Some men bought such dances for their wives or companions. The reason was obvious. When performers danced for women, it looked more sensual. The guys decided that John wouldn't like lap dances and decided to give them to their wives instead. Initially, Marge and Barbara were against it. But after a few glasses of wine and seeing other women also ordering dances, they began to think that it might not be so bad. Marge and Barbara said they wouldn't let the dancers get too carried away and laughed. After teasing and even bribery, the deal was struck. Marge and Barbara agreed to lap dances in exchange for a serious shopping trip the next day. The guys thought they got off cheap. They were willing to pay almost any price for this experience. The dancers were chosen carefully. They chose those who looked friendly and not too intimidating. Barbara and Marge sat in the center of the sofa, and Michael and John sat on either side. When the music started, the dancers pushed aside a small table and began to dance. Marge and Barbara smiled. The dancers were right. This show was Michael and John's dream. The girls-only concept helped women feel more comfortable. They relaxed and began to have fun. The hands of the dancer who danced for Barbara wandered over her body. Barbara looked at Michael and said, "Why can't you touch me like that?" While Michael and John paid the dancers and Barbara and Marge changed, the men at the next table applauded them. The wives were excited, experiencing more adrenaline than sexual arousal. Barbara later said she felt like a student on spring break. Perhaps this explained her behavior when they passed a table with 4 men on the way out of the club. Barbara stopped and, with a flirtatious smile, thanked them for their applause. The men said how great she was and how lucky her husband was. One of them said that he couldn't get a good look because the dancer kept getting in the way. They drove home in silence. Michael and Barbara sat in the front, John and Marge in the back. The only sound was the rustling of clothes as both couples tried to remain calm. Having reached the house, they hastily wished each other good night and went to their rooms. Several hours passed before the excitement that had built up during the night finally found its way out. The 3 of them reminisced about that night as they sat in the dark of the boat's cockpit. But no one discussed what had or had not happened when John slept with Barbara the night before. It was about 10, and Michael led Barbara downstairs, leaving John alone at the helm. Sexual images flashed through John's mind. He imagined Barbara's legs wrapped around his neck. Michael and Barbara headed to the bed to sleep. Barbara was horny with a day full of sexy teasing. She woke up naked with John, then flirted with him and shared intimate moments in the water. She was on fire. She climbed into bed with Michael and closed the door. Michael had seen her like this before. This usually happened after a drinking party. He suspected that on such nights she did not want to feel like a wife. She wanted to feel like a friend, or maybe even a girl picked up at a bar. At times like these, he wondered if she imagined he was someone else, maybe from her earlier days. As hot as these nights were, they also bothered him. Instead of leaving everything to his imagination, he often looked for hidden meaning in them, which made him insecure. However, tonight was different. Michael, like Barbara, was disturbed by the events of the day and the previous night. He was also ready for love. Michael was surprised by her behavior tonight. He asked, either out of jealousy or out of excitement, why was she so excited today? Barbara dodged his question by saying it was just ocean air and wine. But Michael wasn't going to accept that answer. He asked, "Are you sure it's not something else, like last night in bed or today on the tow rope with John?" His question made Barbara feel a little uneasy. She didn't know what to answer. But Michael's body told her that he wanted to hear the truth. "I'm not going to get angry, just tell me about it." "Well, we woke up and found ourselves facing each other. Our legs were intertwined," she said shyly. I pressed myself against his chest. We talked a little, but didn't move. I wanted to know how he got there and why you sent him. "What do you mean by your behavior?" Michael asked. "Well, I do not know. I was excited. I looked at him and kissed him. I guess to get back at you, or at least that was my excuse. The truth is that I was horny, being naked like that. John is a handsome guy." Barbara fell silent, feeling slightly guilty for her excitement. She continued, "Well, we kissed a few times. Then I felt guilty and nervous, so I got up, got dressed, and went to your cubicle. That's all that happened." They woke up an hour after the alarm went off. The sound woke them both up, but Barbara had the clock, and it showed 2 o'clock in the morning. For a while, she hoped that Michael would accept it willingly, but then she decided that John would go to bed with her. She didn't want this to happen again. Michael also slept little, and would have happily stayed in bed. However, he was ready to get up when Barbara got out of bed. She put on a sweatshirt and shorts, and when Michael fell asleep again, she made coffee and went to the cabin. It was an awkward situation for Barbara and John. Both knew that what happened on the V-berth and on the tow rope was something more than just friendship. They exchanged silent glances, reaffirming their devotion to each other and their spouses, and promising that such a thing would not happen again. They talked about the stars, the weather, and the boat. Neither of them dared to discuss what happened between them. A few minutes later, John left Barbara at the helm and went downstairs. John was emotionally upset. As he tried to sleep on his bunk, he thought about his close relationship with Barbara. Although the excitement of this was enormous, difficult to describe in words, he understood that it should not be this way and that it would not happen again. He felt mixed feelings of guilt and excitement. John didn't know that his best friend was also excited when he heard about what happened. For the next few hours, while John and Michael slept below, Barbara was left alone in the cabin with her thoughts. She told Michael everything she did to John. Instead of discussing it in anger, both of them were excited by the discussion. Barbara became horny again. She thought of possible fun ways to explore this new adventure. She remembered the ridiculous jokes and craziness that happened that night at the strip club. A plan began to form in her head. Michael entered the cabin shortly after 6. Barbara, still half asleep, was only able to glimpse him briefly before he descended the ramp. She saw John on the cot, but her mind was already occupied with sleep. Barbara fell onto the bed without even undressing and immediately fell asleep. Around 10 in the morning, John woke up to the sound of Barbara taking a shower. She came out in a sweatshirt and panties. John pretended to be asleep as he busied himself in the galley, making coffee and warming up muffins. He found her bare legs fascinating, and even though her sweatshirt covered most of her body, he felt like he could see through it. She reached for the coffee mugs, and the sweatshirt rode up, exposing her thin panties, draped sensually over her ass. He didn't look up at her. While her back was turned, he was able to move from the bunk and pull on his shorts. Together they grabbed coffee and muffins and went upstairs to join Michael. Almost an hour had passed when Barbara began her little game. The three of them drank coffee, had muffins for breakfast, and talked a little. Barbara was still in her sweatshirt and panties, combing her freshly washed hair when she started talking about John's birthday last year. She reminded the others that John still hadn't gotten his promised lap dance. John responded that watching Barbara and Marge give a lap dance was more fun than any lap dance he could have gotten. Barbara shook her head and said, "I bet. I'll give you a lap dance you'll never forget." He was stunned. He couldn't imagine how this could happen, especially with Michael. He was silent, with his mouth open. Barbara added, "It was Michael's idea. He argued with me." This was news to Michael. Of course, he noticed that Barbara was sexy enough to work in such a place. They even joked that wives should give their husbands a lap dance. But Michael guessed where this was all going. Last night, when they were both excited by Barbara's story about meeting John, clearly indicated this. Barbara was going to create some real excitement, and he wasn't going to stop that. The men watched as Barbara took off her sweatshirt and approached John wearing only her panties. She took off his shirt and shorts, leaving him in his boxers. She sat on his lap and slowly began to press herself against him. John felt his boxers tighten under her touch. He looked at Michael nervously. But Michael smiled. In fact, there were no rules. There was only a tacit agreement that it was all just a game. But as the excitement grew, the prohibitions went aside and the rules became unimportant. Michael watched in amazement. He knew his wife well. He knew what she looked like when she was excited. He knew this wouldn't just end in a lap dance. When John recovered, Barbara looked at Michael. She wanted more. Michael had never seen his wife with another man. It was a new, intensely sexual experience. Although he felt twinges of jealousy, he couldn't help but admit his arousal. Barbara lifted Michael from the small, soft sofa. They continued, not paying attention to John, although he was nearby. He was restored to life, For a while, everyone just lay there, catching their breath. They were all worried. Perhaps they've gone too far. Barbara put Michael's head on her shoulder and asked if everything was okay. Michael hugged her and said, "This was the most exciting adventure of my life. It couldn't have been better." The three of them smiled at each other, enjoying the after effects of the incredible passion they had just shared. A few hours later, they arrived in the Abaco area and headed to Marsh Harbor. Tonight, they planned to dock and have dinner at a local restaurant. Tomorrow, as the sun rose over the Atlantic, the plan was to skydive on the mainland and then head home to North Carolina. The adventure was over.